Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what truly matters. Sometimes the greatest discoveries happen when we think we have nothing left to lose. Ethan Cole is a broken man walking through the Swiss Alps. His wife is gone. His young daughter barely speaks to him anymore. The former military medic has lost his family, his purpose, and his will to keep fighting. He's taking what might be his last job as a mountain guide, hoping the silence of the mountains will quiet the pain. In his heart, then he finds the wreckage, an old private jet, hidden in a remote valley where no one should ever find it. When Ethan looks inside, he discovers something that makes him break down crying. Something that changes everything he thought he knew about loss, hope, and second chances. What could be in that wreck that would make a hardened soldier weep? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 18 months ago, Ethan Cole had been a different man entirely. He'd wake each morning to the sound of his wife Sarah humming in the kitchen, the rich aroma of coffee mixing with the sweet scent of her vanilla perfume. Their 8-year-old daughter Emma would bound down the stairs in mismatched socks, her wild curls refusing to stay in the ponytail Sarah had carefully crafted the night before. "Daddy, look what I drew for you," Emma would say, thrusting a crayon masterpiece into his hands before he'd even finished his first sip of coffee. Pictures of stick figures holding hands under rainbow skies, always with "I love you, Daddy," scrawled in purple letters across the bottom. Those mornings felt like a lifetime ago now. They belonged to a man who believed in permanence, who took for granted that love could shield his family from the random cruelties of the world. That man had been confident, steady, a former army medic who'd learned to save lives under pressure, who'd transitioned those skills into building a successful mountain guiding business in the Swiss Alps. Ethan had met Sarah during his final tour of duty in Afghanistan. She was a nurse with Doctors Without Borders, fierce and compassionate, with eyes the color of mountain lakes and a laugh that could cut through the darkest moments. They'd fallen in love amid the chaos of a field hospital, finding peace in each other when the world around them offered none. After they married, they'd settled in the small alpine village of Grindelwald, where Ethan's military training and love for the mountains had naturally evolved into guiding wealthy tourists and serious climbers through some of Europe's most challenging terrain. Sarah had found work at the local clinic, and Emma had been born 3 years later, a perfect, pink-cheeked miracle who transformed their cozy cottage into a home filled with laughter. For 8 beautiful years, they'd built something precious. Ethan would lead expeditions during the peak seasons, always returning home to Sarah's warm embrace and Emma's eager questions about his adventures. The three of them would spend quiet evenings by the fireplace, Emma nestled between her parents, as Sarah read stories in her gentle voice and Ethan added dramatic sound effects that made their daughter giggle. "Promise me you'll always come home, mountain man," Sarah would whisper during their private moments, her fingers tracing the scar on his shoulder from his military days. "We need you here." "Always," he'd promise, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "Nothing could keep me from you too." But promises, Ethan learned, are fragile things that can shatter in an instant. The accident happened on a Tuesday in March. Sarah had been driving Emma to school when a delivery truck ran a red light at the intersection near the village center. The impact killed Sarah instantly. Emma survived with a broken arm and nightmares that still wake her screaming in the middle of the night. Ethan had been guiding a group of climbers up the north face of the Eiger when he got the call. He'd descended that mountain faster than he'd ever moved in his life, rappelling down cliff faces and running through snow that should have been impossible to navigate at that speed. But he was still too late. By the time he reached the hospital, Sarah was gone, and Emma lay sedated in a bed that made her look impossibly small. The guilt consumed him from that moment forward. If he'd been home instead of on the mountain, maybe he could have driven Emma to school that day. Maybe Sarah would still be alive. Maybe his daughter wouldn't flinch every time he tried to hug her, as if his touch carried the memory of loss itself. Emma's maternal grandparents, the Webers, had stepped in during those first horrible weeks when Ethan could barely function. They'd taken Emma to their home in Zurich while he tried to piece together a world that no longer made sense. What was supposed to be a temporary arrangement had stretched into months as Ethan struggled with depression, guilt, and a business that was crumbling without his full attention. Emma needs stability, Helen Weber had told him during one of their increasingly tense phone conversations. She needs routine and people who won't disappear on dangerous expeditions. The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. Ethan's work did require him to be away for days at a time, sometimes in situations where communication was impossible. But it was also his livelihood, his passion, and one of the few things that still connected him to the man he'd been before everything fell apart. "I'm her father," he'd argued, standing in the empty cottage that still smelled like Sarah's perfume. "She belongs here, with me." "Look around, Ethan," Helen had said, her voice not unkind but firm. "What do you have to offer her right now? You can barely take care of yourself." She'd been right, and that truth cut deeper than any physical wound he'd ever sustained. The cottage that had once been filled with warmth and laughter now felt like a mausoleum. He'd stopped cooking real meals, surviving on coffee and whatever he could grab from the village store. Bills piled up on the kitchen table beside sympathy cards he couldn't bear to open. The business that had once thrived now struggled as word spread that the reliable Ethan Cole was no longer quite so reliable. His last conversation with Emma had been 3 weeks ago, awkward and stilted over the phone. She'd answered with a quiet, "Hello, Daddy," but her voice held a distance that broke his heart. "How's school, sweetheart?" he'd asked, staring at the framed photo on his mantelpiece, the three of them at last Christmas, Emma wearing the red sweater Sarah had knitted, all of them laughing at something ridiculous he'd said. "It's okay," Emma had replied. "Oma made cookies." "That's nice. I love you, Emma. You know that, right?" A long pause. "I know. I have to go do homework now." The line had gone dead, leaving Ethan alone with the echo of his daughter's polite but distant voice. That night, he'd sat on the floor of her empty bedroom, surrounded by toys and books that waited for a little girl who might never come home. The job that brought him to these remote peaks had come through Marcus, one of his few remaining regular clients, a wealthy German businessman who appreciated Ethan's skill and discretion. The commission was simple: guide a solo trek through an uncharted route in the high Alps, map the terrain for a potential future expedition. It paid well enough to keep the lights on for another few months, and more importantly, it offered solitude. Ethan had accepted not because he needed the money, though he did, but because he needed to disappear. The mountains had always been his sanctuary, the place where the noise in his head quieted and the world made sense again. If this was to be his last job, if he was finally ready to admit that Helen Weber was right and he had nothing left to offer his daughter, at least he could end it somewhere beautiful. He'd packed light, basic camping gear, emergency supplies, and the worn leather journal where he recorded route details for clients. The only personal item he'd brought was Sarah's wedding ring, which he wore on a chain around his neck. He couldn't bring himself to wear it on his finger. That felt like claiming a title he'd lost the right to when he'd failed to protect her. The weather had been perfect for the first 3 days of the trek, crisp and clear with visibility that stretched for miles in every direction. Ethan had methodically mapped the route, taking GPS coordinates and detailed notes about terrain difficulty and potential hazards. The work was routine, meditative, allowing his mind to focus on immediate, practical concerns rather than the larger questions that haunted his sleepless nights. But on the 4th morning, as he'd crested a ridge that his topographical maps showed as unexplored territory, he'd seen something that shouldn't have been there. Metal glinting in the morning sunlight, partially hidden by a rocky outcropping in a narrow valley below. At first, he'd assumed it was debris from a recent climbing expedition. perhaps a cache of equipment left by mountaineers planning a return trip. But as he'd descended into the valley for a closer look, the shape had resolved into something much larger and more troubling. An aircraft. Specifically, what appeared to be a private jet, its white fuselage scarred and weathered but still recognizable. The nose was crumpled against a massive boulder, and one wing had sheared completely off, but the main body of the plane remained largely intact. Ethan had seen enough crash sites during his military service to recognize this wasn't recent. The metal showed signs of weathering that suggested years of exposure to alpine conditions. Lichen grew across portions of the fuselage, and snow had drifted into the gaps where panels had been torn away by impact. But what struck him most was the location. This valley wasn't on any flight path he knew of, and it certainly wasn't the kind of place where a private jet would have any business being. More puzzling still, he'd heard no reports of missing aircraft in this region, and Switzerland's aviation authorities were meticulous about such things. Standing at the edge of what was clearly a crash site, Ethan had felt the first stirring of genuine curiosity he'd experienced in months. It was a mystery that had nothing to do with his own failures, and everything to do with questions that might actually have answers. He'd approached the wreckage carefully, his military training reasserting itself as he scanned for potential dangers. The plane had come to rest at an angle that left the passenger compartment accessible through a gap where the fuselage had buckled. Peering inside, he'd seen the skeletal remains of what had once been luxury seating, now home to nothing but shadows and the peculiar silence that settles over places where life has ended. And that's when he'd seen it, a small, weathered object that would change everything. A child's drawing, somehow preserved in a protected pocket of the wreckage, showing a family of 3 holding hands under a bright yellow sun. The moment Ethan saw that drawing, something inside him had broken wide, open not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. Another father who'd failed to bring his family home safely. Another child whose artwork would never be proudly displayed on a refrigerator door. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, Ethan Cole had wept. Ethan wiped his eyes with the back of his gloved hand, embarrassed by the sudden flood of emotion. He hadn't cried since the day they'd lowered Sarah's casket into the frozen ground, and he certainly hadn't expected to break down over a stranger's family drawing in the middle of nowhere. But something about that simple artwork, 3-stick figures under a child's version of perfect sunshine, had struck him like a physical blow. It could have been drawn by Emma. Hell, it could have been one of the dozens of similar pictures she'd made for him over the years. Pictures he'd proudly pinned to his office wall before the accident stole everything that mattered. He forced himself to breathe steadily, drawing on the emotional control that had kept him functional during his worst moments overseas. Focus on the immediate situation. Assess, analyze, take action. The wreckage told a story, and Ethan had enough experience with crash sites to read the narrative written in twisted metal and impact patterns. This hadn't been a controlled emergency. Landing. The jet had come down hard and fast, probably with little or no warning. The angle of impact suggested the pilot had been trying to pull up at the last second, fighting to save his passengers even as physics worked against him. Ethan climbed carefully into the passenger compartment, his boots crunching on debris that had been scattered by years of weather and small scavengers. The interior was a tomb of luxury turned tragic, leather seats split and faded, personal belongings scattered and frozen in time. But it was what he found in the cockpit that made him pause. A leather flight logbook, wedged between the pilot's seat and the instrument panel, its pages water-damaged but still partially legible. Ethan extracted it carefully, treating it with the reverence due to what might be someone's final words. The pilot's handwriting was neat, professional, Captain Heinrich Möller, according to the name embossed on the cover. The entries were methodical, recording weather conditions, flight times, and routine maintenance notes. But as Ethan flipped toward the final entries, the tone changed. Client extremely agitated, insists on immediate departure despite weather warnings. Klaus Hoffmann seems genuinely terrified of something. Wife and child pale, frightened, have advised against flight, but Hoffmann offering double fee for immediate takeoff. The next entry, dated what appeared to be the day of the crash, was shorter and written in a shakier hand. Radio contact lost, navigation systems malfunctioning, client shouting about being followed. God help us. The final entry was just 3 words. We're going down. Ethan closed the logbook, his mind racing. Klaus Hoffmann. That was a name, a starting point. But what struck him most was the pilot's reference to being followed. This wasn't sounding like a weather-related accident or mechanical failure. This sounded like people running from something or someone. He began a systematic search of the passenger area, his military training taking over as he documented everything he found. 3 distinct seating areas suggested 3 passengers, which matched the family in the child's drawing. Personal luggage scattered throughout the cabin told stories of lives interrupted, expensive clothing, a woman's jewelry, a businessman's briefcase, and a small pink backpack that made Ethan's chest tighten. The briefcase was locked, its combination mechanism corroded but still functional. Ethan made a mental note to examine it more thoroughly later. The pink backpack was easier to access, its zipper frozen but workable. Inside, he found the kinds of things any 8-year-old girl might pack for a trip. A few changes of clothes, a worn stuffed rabbit, a children's book about dragons, and more drawings. The drawings were all signed Lisa H. in careful block letters. Pictures of houses and flowers, of a family at what looked like a zoo, of a little girl riding a pony. Normal, happy artwork from a child who'd had no idea her world was about to end. At the bottom of the backpack, wrapped in a plastic bag that had protected it from moisture, Ethan found something that made his blood run cold, a small digital camera, the kind children used to take pictures of their adventures. The battery was long dead, but the memory card might still be intact. He pocketed the camera along with the pilot's logbook, then continued his search. In the woman's purse, an expensive leather bag that had somehow remained largely protected under a seat, he found identification. Anna Hoffmann, age 34, residence listed as an address in Munich. The photo showed a beautiful woman with kind eyes and blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Klaus Hoffmann's wallet contained more information, business cards, identifying him as CEO of Hoffmann Industries, a company Ethan vaguely recognized from financial news. Credit cards, family photos, and nearly 3,000 euros in cash, more money than most people carried unless they were planning to be away from banks for a while. But it was what he found in the seat pocket behind Klaus's chair that made Ethan's skin crawl. A handwritten note, obviously penned in haste. If something happens to us, contact Father Michael at St. Bartholomew in Salzburg. He has the evidence. Tell him the Munich files are with the American journalist. They killed. Robert, we're next. The note was unsigned, but the handwriting matched the signature on Klaus's credit cards. Ethan read the note 3 times, each reading making the implications clearer and more disturbing. This family hadn't been fleeing bad weather or business, and problems. They'd been running for their lives, carrying evidence of something serious enough that people were willing to commit murder to keep it secret. He photographed the note with his phone, then carefully placed it back where he'd found it. His hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, but from the realization that he'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple aircraft accident. The logical thing would be to hike back to civilization and report the crash site to the authorities. Let the proper investigators determine what had happened to the Hoffmann family and why their deaths had apparently gone unreported. Ethan had enough problems of his own without taking on the mysteries of strangers, but as he looked around the cabin one more time, his eyes fell again on Lisa's drawings scattered among the debris. This 7-year-old girl had died terrified, probably calling for her parents as the plane went down. She died because her father had possessed knowledge that someone wanted to keep buried. And according to every database Ethan could think to check, her death had never been officially recorded. No missing persons reports, no aviation incident investigations, no media coverage. The Hoffman family had simply vanished from the world as if they'd never existed. Someone had made sure of that. The military medic in Ethan rebelled against leaving things unfinished. He'd spent years fighting to save lives and seek justice for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The fact that his own life had fallen apart didn't change his fundamental nature. Maybe he couldn't save his marriage or rebuild his relationship with Emma. Maybe he was destined to be one of those broken veterans who never quite managed to translate their service into a successful civilian life. But he could damn well make sure that Klaus, Anna, and Lisa Hoffman didn't remain forgotten victims of whatever conspiracy had killed them. As Ethan climbed out of the wreckage and back into the crisp mountain air, he made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life. He wasn't going to report this crash site, not yet. First, he was going to find out what had really happened to this family and why their deaths had been covered up. He was going to give them the justice they deserved, even if it was the last meaningful thing he ever did. The sun was beginning to set behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the valley where the Hoffman family's journey had ended. Ethan shouldered his pack and began the trek back to his camp, the pilot's logbook secured in his jacket pocket and a new sense of purpose burning in his chest. For the first time in 18 months, Ethan Cole had a mission that mattered more than his own pain. Ethan's camp that night felt different than it had for the past 4 days. The small mountain tent that had been his refuge from grief now served as a command post. The pilot's logbook spread open beside his sleeping bag while he studied the entries by LED headlamp. The words took on new meaning with each reading, painting. A picture of a family in desperate flight from forces they couldn't escape. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by questions that multiplied faster than he could process them. Why had Klaus Hoffman been carrying evidence dangerous enough to warrant murder? Who was Robert, and how had he died? What was in the Munich files that Father Michael supposedly held in Salzburg? Dawn brought clarity of purpose, if not answers. Ethan broke camp efficiently, his movements sharp and focused in a way they hadn't been since his military days. He had a mystery to solve, and solving it would require more than mountain survival skills. The hike back to the crash site took less than an hour. In daylight, with his emotional response under control, Ethan could conduct a more thorough investigation. He started with a detailed photographic survey, documenting the wreckage from every angle. The impact pattern told a clearer story now. This jet had come down at a steep angle, suggesting either pilot error, mechanical failure, or external interference. Inside the passenger compartment, methodical searching revealed details he'd missed in his initial shock. The seats had been configured for maximum privacy, with individual work areas that suggested this was a business aircraft used for confidential meetings. Klaus Hoffman's seat showed signs of recent use. Papers scattered on the fold-down table, a coffee cup still secured in its holder. It was while examining Anna Hoffman's seat area that Ethan made his most significant discovery. Wedged deep between the seat cushion and armrest, protected from weather and scavengers, he found a child's crayon drawing that made his heart stop. The picture showed 3 stick figures holding hands. A tall figure labeled Papa, a shorter one marked Mama, and a tiny figure with yellow scribbles for hair labeled Lisa. Above them, in careful block letters, the child had written, "My family is the best." At the bottom, in what must have been a parent's handwriting, someone had added, "For Daddy's office, love Lisa, age 7. Ethan stared at the drawing for a long time, seeing Emma in every carefully drawn line. This could have been one of his daughter's masterpieces, proudly displayed on his desk before his world shattered. The innocence captured in those simple figures, a child's absolute faith that her family would always be together, always be safe. Cut through his chest like a blade, but it was more than emotional resonance that kept him transfixed. The drawing represented something crucial. This family had been living a normal life right up until the moment they'd been forced to run. Lisa had been making artwork for her father's office. Anna had been encouraging her daughter's creativity. Klaus had been planning to display his child's love where colleagues and clients could see it. Whatever had destroyed their world had happened. Suddenly, Ethan carefully photographed the drawing, then secured it in a protective sleeve in his pack. This wasn't just evidence, it was a sacred trust. Lisa Hoffman had created this picture with love, never knowing it would become a memorial to her family's last happy moments. The search of Klaus's briefcase required more creative problem-solving. The combination lock was corroded but functional, its 3-digit mechanism offering 999 possible combinations. Ethan started with the obvious: birth dates, anniversaries, simple numerical sequences. Nothing worked. Then he remembered the family. Photos in Klaus's wallet. The most recent showed the three of them at what appeared to be a birthday party, with Lisa wearing a party hat and holding up 7 fingers. 7-year-old Lisa. Born in what year? Klaus appeared to be in his early 40s, Anna in her mid-30s. If Lisa was 7 now, she'd been born around 2016. Ethan tried 7/16, July 16th, no result. He tried variations, 167, 7/16, 076. Still nothing. Frustration mounted until he looked again at the drawing. Lisa had carefully printed her age, 7. What if Klaus had used a combination that honored his daughter more directly? He tried 777. The lock clicked open. Inside the briefcase, Ethan found a portable hard drive, several manila folders thick with documents, and a letter marked, "To be opened only in case of emergency." The letter was addressed to Anna, written in Klaus's careful handwriting. "My dearest Anna," it began, "if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass. The evidence contained in this briefcase represents 3 years of careful documentation of criminal activities within my own company. I had hoped to handle this situation through proper channels, but Robert's death has made it clear that these people will stop at nothing to protect their secrets." Ethan read the letter twice, his military mind automatically cataloging the implications. Klaus Hoffman had been gathering evidence against criminal elements within his own company. Someone named Robert, presumably Robert Hoffman, possibly Klaus's brother based on the surname, had been killed, likely for the same reason Klaus and his family were now dead. The documents in the briefcase told a story of massive financial fraud. Hoffman Industries, according to these papers, had been used as a front for money laundering operations connected to drug trafficking and arms dealing. Klaus had discovered the scheme gradually, documenting transactions, photographing meetings, recording conversations. One folder contained photographs of men Ethan didn't recognize, but their bearing and the expensive suits suggested serious players in international crime. Another folder held bank routing numbers, transaction records, and what appeared to be coded communications between Hoffman Industries executives and their criminal partners. The most damning evidence was a series of emails Klaus had printed and annotated. The correspondence detailed plans to eliminate security risks, corporate euphemism for murdering anyone who threatened to expose the operation. Robert Hoffman's name appeared multiple times, always in the context of being handled or neutralized. 1. Email dated just 2 weeks before the crash chilled Ethan's blood. Klaus is becoming a problem. He's asking too many questions and has been seen photographing documents. Recommend immediate action before he can share what he knows. Make it. Look accidental, family vacation gone wrong. The response was equally cold. Understood. Munich team will handle during the planned trip to Salzburg. Fuel system malfunction over the Alps should be sufficient. No survivors, no investigation. Ethan sat back on his heels, the full scope of the crime becoming clear. This hadn't been an aircraft accident or even a simple murder. This had been a carefully planned assassination disguised as an accident, carried out by professionals who'd ensured the crash would never be investigated. But something had gone wrong with their plan. The jet had crashed in this remote valley instead of the intended location, and Klaus's evidence had survived. More importantly, there was no indication that the killers had ever found the wreckage to confirm their success. For 3 years, Klaus, Hoffman's murderers, had been operating under the assumption that their crime was perfect and their secrets were safe. They'd continued their criminal enterprise, confident that the only witness to their activities was dead and buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the Alps. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Ethan secured the briefcase and its contents, then conducted one final search of the wreckage. In the cockpit, he found the jet's black box, a device that should have made this crash impossible to hide. The fact that no search and rescue operation had been mounted, despite the existence of recorded flight data, confirmed what Klaus's documents suggested. The authorities who should have investigated this crash had been bought, threatened, or otherwise compromised. As he prepared to leave the crash site, Ethan took one last look at the twisted metal that had become the Hoffman family's tomb. Klaus, Anna, and Lisa deserved better than to be forgotten victims of corporate greed. They deserved justice, and they deserved the truth. But more than that, they deserved to have their story told by someone who understood the weight of loss, someone who knew what it meant to fail the people you loved most. Ethan might not be able to save his own family, but he could damn well make sure the Hoffmans hadn't died for nothing. The passenger manifest had been tucked inside the pilot's logbook, a simple document that would normally be routine paperwork, but now read like an epitaph. Captain Heinrich Müller, age 52, Klaus Hoffmann, age 41, Anna Hoffmann, age 34, Lisa Hoffmann, age 7, 4 lives reduced to names, ages, and a flight number that had never officially existed. Ethan studied the manifest during his descent from the crash site, memorizing every detail. The flight plan indicated a route from Munich to Salzburg, a short journey that should have taken less than an hour. Instead, it had become the final chapter in the lives of a family whose only crime had been stumbling onto the truth. Back in the village of Grindelwald, Ethan felt like an imposter among the tourists and climbers going about their normal lives. He sat in a small cafe, nursing coffee that had long gone cold, while he used the establishment's Wi-Fi to begin his investigation. The laptop he'd brought for route documentation now served a different purpose entirely. Klaus Hoffmann's online presence painted the picture of a successful businessman who'd built Hoffman Industries into a mid-sized manufacturing conglomerate, specializing in precision machinery. The company's website featured the usual corporate rhetoric about innovation and integrity, with Klaus prominently displayed as CEO and founder. There was even a section highlighting the company's charitable work, including a foundation dedicated to providing clean water systems in developing countries. None of it suggested the criminal enterprise Klaus had documented in his briefcase. Digging deeper, Ethan found business journals praising Klaus's leadership and vision. A profile in a German business magazine from the previous year had described him as a devoted family man who brings the same precision to fatherhood that has made his company a leader in advanced manufacturing. The article included a photo of Klaus, Anna, and Lisa at a company picnic, all 3 of them laughing at something outside the camera's view. The contrast between the public Klaus Hoffmann and the terrified man who'd written that desperate note to his wife was stark. This had been a man living a double life, successful executive by day, secret investigator by night, gathering evidence that would ultimately cost him everything. Anna Hoffmann's digital footprint was smaller but equally telling. Her social media accounts showed a woman devoted to her family and her work as a part-time teacher. Photos of Lisa's school events, family vacations, and quiet moments at home painted a picture of domestic happiness that made Ethan's chest ache with recognition. But it was Lisa's presence in these online glimpses that hit hardest. A 7-year-old girl who loved horses, drawing, and helping her mother bake cookies. Her artwork adorned the refrigerator in several photos, including one picture that showed a drawing remarkably similar to the one Ethan had found in the wreckage. The parallels to his own lost family were impossible to ignore. Emma, at 7, had been equally artistic, equally devoted to covering every available surface with her creations. Sarah had indulged their daughter's creativity the same way Anna apparently had, turning their home into a gallery of childhood imagination. Seeing the Hoffmans' normal, happy life, documented in casual social media posts, made their deaths feel both more real and more tragic. These weren't distant strangers whose story he'd stumbled into. They were people who'd lived and loved and planned for futures they'd never see. The investigation took on greater urgency as Ethan discovered what the official records didn't show. According to German aviation authorities, no Hoffman Industries aircraft had filed a flight plan for the date of the crash. According to Munich police, no missing persons reports had been filed for Klaus, Anna, or Lisa Hoffman. According to the company's own website, Klaus was listed as being on an extended business trip with no specified return date. Someone had been very thorough in erasing the Hoffman family's final journey from official records. But digital erasure was rarely complete, and Ethan's military experience had taught him how to find traces that others might miss. A cached Google search revealed a now-deleted news item about Klaus Hoffman's sudden decision to step back from day-to-day operations to focus on family time. The article was dated 3 days before the crash and had been published by a small business newsletter. More telling was what he found in Lisa's school records, accessed through a parent's portal that Anna's password, LisaLove7, still unlocked. The school had been notified that Lisa would be absent for an extended family emergency beginning the day of the crash. No return date had been specified and no subsequent communication had been received from the family. The school's automated system had been sending attendance warnings to Anna's email address for months, unaware that the recipient was beyond the reach of such concerns. Ethan's search led him to Father Michael at St. Bartholomew in Salzburg, the contact mentioned in Klaus's desperate note. The church's website listed Father Michael Brennan as associate pastor with a background in social justice advocacy and corporate ethics counseling. This wasn't just any priest. This was someone with the knowledge and connections to understand the significance of whatever evidence Klaus had been carrying. A phone call to the church provided more questions than answers. Father Brennan was described as being on extended retreat with no contact information available. The timing of his disappearance, beginning shortly after the Hoffmans would have been expected to arrive in Salzburg, suggested either coincidence or something far more sinister. The American journalist mentioned in Klaus's note proved even more difficult to trace. Without a name or publication, Ethan could only speculate about who might have been investigating Hoffman Industries. A search of recent business journalism about the company revealed several critical articles about environmental violations and labor practices, but nothing that suggested awareness of criminal activity. One article, however, caught his attention. A piece in the International Herald Tribune had raised questions about Hoffman Industries' rapid expansion and unusually diverse client base. The reporter, Janet Morrison, had noted inconsistencies in the company's financial reports and questioned how a precision machinery manufacturer had managed to secure contracts in regions known more for conflict than industry. Morrison's article was dated 6 months before the crash, and her byline indicated she specialized in investigating corporate crime and international money laundering. If Klaus had been in contact with an American journalist, Morrison seemed like the most likely candidate. But like Father Brennan, Janet Morrison had apparently vanished from public view shortly after the Hoffmans' deaths. Her newspaper listed her as being on assignment overseas with no specific location or return date provided. The pattern was becoming clear and deeply troubling. Everyone Klaus Hoffmann had trusted with his evidence had either disappeared or died, leaving Ethan as potentially the only person who knew the truth about what had happened to this family. That realization brought with it a cold understanding of his own danger. If the people responsible for the Hoffmans' deaths learned that someone had found the crash site and the evidence it contained, they wouldn't hesitate to add another victim to their list. Ethan thought of Emma, safe with her grandparents in Zurich, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. His investigation into the Hoffman family's murder had put his own daughter at risk, creating a terrible parallel to the very crime he was trying to solve. But shutting down the investigation wasn't an option. The evidence in Klaus's briefcase represented 3 years of careful documentation and the last testament of a man who died trying to expose the truth. Abandoning it now would mean Lisa's drawings and Anna's love and Klaus's courage had all been for nothing. More than that, it would mean accepting that some crimes were too big to solve, some criminals too powerful to challenge. Ethan had spent too many years fighting for justice to walk away from a battle this important, even if it cost him everything he had left to lose. As evening settled over Grindelwald, Ethan made secure copies of all the evidence and uploaded them to an encrypted cloud storage account. If something happened to him, at least the truth would survive. Then he composed a detailed email to Emma's grandparents, explaining that his work in the mountains might take longer than expected, but assuring them that he was safe and would contact them soon. He didn't mention that he was about to declare war on an organization that had already proven its willingness to murder entire families to protect its secrets. The encrypted USB drive had been hidden in a secret compartment of Klaus's briefcase. Its existence, revealed only when Ethan noticed the case's internal dimensions, didn't match its external measurements. Finding the hidden panel required the same methodical patience he'd learned during his military service, but the discovery was worth the effort. The drive was military-grade encryption, the kind of device used by intelligence services and serious criminals who understood the value of protecting sensitive information. Klaus Hoffmann hadn't been just a businessman gathering evidence. He'd been operating like a professional spy, using sophisticated tools and techniques that suggested either extensive training or very knowledgeable allies. Accessing the drive required help, and Ethan knew exactly who to call. Marcus Webb had been his communications specialist during their deployment in Afghanistan, a tech genius who'd transitioned his military skills into private cybersecurity consulting. If anyone could crack Klaus's encryption, it would be Marcus. Chugged. Call was answered on the second ring. "Ethan Cole, you stubborn mountain goat. I heard you were having a rough time. How are you holding up?" The genuine concern in Marcus's voice was almost enough to break Ethan's carefully maintained composure. He and Marcus had saved each other's lives more than once during their service, and their friendship had survived the transition to civilian life despite the geographic distance between them. "I'm managing," Ethan replied, which was both true and completely inadequate. "But I need a favor, and it's not simple. When has anything involving you ever been simple? What do you need?" Ethan explained about the USB drive without revealing the full scope of what he'd discovered. Marcus listened without interruption, his silence conveying both understanding and concern. "Military-grade encryption on a businessman's USB drive?" Marcus finally said. "That's not standard corporate security. Someone was expecting serious attempts to access this information. Can you crack it?" "Probably, but it'll take time and I'll need physical access to the drive." "Where are you?" "Switzerland. Can you travel?" "For you?" "Of course. Send me coordinates and I'll be there tomorrow." While waiting for Marcus to arrive, Ethan continued his investigation into Hoffman Industries, using more conventional methods. Corporate filings revealed a complex web of subsidiaries and partnerships that would have made financial forensics experts weep. The company had holdings in 17 countries, partnerships with firms in industries ranging from legitimate manufacturing to questionable resource extraction, but it was the client list that began to tell the real story. Hoffman Industries had contracts with companies known to be fronts for criminal organizations, governments with appalling human rights records, and private military contractors whose activities existed in the gray areas between legal business and international crime. A precision machinery manufacturer had no legitimate business selling equipment to Sudanese diamond mines or Colombian agricultural cooperatives that operated in regions controlled by drug cartels. These weren't manufacturing contracts. They were money laundering operations designed to make criminal proceeds appear legitimate. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. According to Klaus's preliminary documentation, Hoffman Industries had processed over 200 million euros in illegal funds during the past 3 years alone. The company served as a financial washing machine for some of the world's most dangerous criminal organizations. Marcus arrived the next morning, his appearance drawing curious looks from the tourists and locals in Grindelwald. He hadn't lost the military bearing that made him stand out in civilian crowds, and his equipment bag suggested he was serious about the technical challenge ahead. "You look like hell," he said by way of greeting, studying Ethan's face with the directness of old friendship. "When's the last time you actually slept?" "Sleep's overrated," Ethan replied, leading Marcus to his rented room above the cafe. "Thanks for coming. Don't thank me yet. Military-grade encryption isn't something you crack over coffee and pastries. This could take days." It took Marcus 6 hours. The breakthrough came when he realized that Klaus hadn't just been using military-grade encryption. He'd been using software specifically designed for intelligence operatives working in hostile territory. The encryption protocol included multiple authentication layers and self-destruct mechanisms that would have defeated conventional attempts to access the data. "Whoever set this up wasn't messing around," Marcus said, his fingers dancing across his laptop keyboard as code scrolled past faster than Ethan could follow. "This is NSA-level stuff. Your businessman friend had some serious help setting up his security." When the encryption finally yielded, the contents of the drive were overwhelming. Klaus had documented every aspect of the criminal operation with the thoroughness of a prosecutor building a case. Financial records, photographs, audio recordings, email intercepts, meeting transcripts, 3 years of evidence that could bring down not just Hoffman Industries, but the entire criminal network it served. The most damning files were video recordings of meetings between Hoffman Industries executives and known international criminals. Klaus had somehow managed to record board meetings where participants discussed human trafficking, arms dealing, and contract killings with the casual tone of executives planning quarterly earnings reports. One video showed a meeting between Klaus's business partner, Friedrich Brenner, and a man Ethan recognized from Interpol's most wanted list. Viktor Kozlov was a Russian crime boss whose organization specialized in trafficking weapons to conflict zones and drugs to European markets. In the recording, Kozlov and Brenner discussed using Hoffman Industries' shipping network to move special cargo through European ports. Special cargo turned out to be children destined for sexual exploitation and weapons bound for terrorist organizations. Another recording captured Brenner authorizing the murder of a German journalist who'd been asking questions about the company's finances. The journalist, a woman named Petra Hoffman, had been found dead in her apartment 3 weeks later. Her death officially ruled a suicide despite evidence suggesting otherwise. But it was the final video that made Ethan's blood run cold. Klaus had recorded a meeting where his own death was being planned. Brenner and 2 other executives discussed the Klaus problem with the detached efficiency of managers handling a personnel issue. "He's becoming too curious," Brenner said in the recording. The American journalist contacted him directly last. Our source in the police says he's been asking questions about Robert's death. Robert Hoffman, Ethan realized, had been Klaus's brother and business partner. According to the files, Robert had discovered the criminal activities first and had been murdered when he'd threatened to expose them. Klaus had inherited both his brother's shares in the company and his brother's dangerous knowledge. "Make it clean," Brenner continued in the recording. "Aircraft accident during the family trip to Salzburg. Fuel system malfunction over the Alps. The weather's been bad enough that search and rescue won't be able to mount an immediate response." The third executive, a woman Ethan didn't recognize, nodded approvingly. "Our contact in the aviation authority will ensure the investigation is minimal. Mechanical failure, pilot error, case closed. Watching Klaus's murder being planned with such casual brutality was almost more than Ethan could stomach. This had been a man trying to honor his dead brother's memory and protect his own family, only to discover that his business partners were perfectly willing to kill children to protect their profits. But Klaus had been smarter than his would-be. Killers realized. The video files included timestamps showing they'd been automatically uploaded to secure servers in multiple countries. Even if Klaus died, his evidence would survive. "There's more," Marcus said, his voice grim as he continued, exploring the drive's contents. "Your friend wasn't just gathering evidence, he was building a case with help from some very serious people." The final folder on the drive contained correspondence between Klaus and contacts in German intelligence, Interpol, and the FBI. He'd been working with an international task force dedicated to dismantling criminal financial networks, providing intelligence that had already led to several major arrests in other countries. Klaus Hoffman hadn't just been a businessman who'd stumbled onto corporate crime. He'd been an active intelligence asset, helping to build cases against some of the world's most dangerous criminal organizations. His murder hadn't just been about protecting Hoffman Industries' secrets. It had been about preventing the collapse of a criminal network worth billions of dollars. The realization transformed Ethan's understanding of what he was facing. This wasn't just a corporate cover-up or even a simple murder case. This was an international criminal conspiracy that had already killed dozens of people and wouldn't hesitate to kill dozens more to protect itself. And now Ethan Cole, a broken mountain guide from a small Swiss village, had evidence that could bring the entire operation crashing down. "What do you want to do with this?" Marcus asked, his expression reflecting the weight of what they'd uncovered. Ethan thought of Lisa's drawings, of Anna's gentle smile in the family photos, of Klaus's desperate note to his wife. He thought of Emma, safe with her grandparents, but still struggling to understand why her world had fallen apart. "We're going to finish what Klaus started," he said. "We're going to make sure these bastards pay for what they did." Marcus nodded slowly. "You know they'll try to kill us, right? These people don't leave loose ends." "Let them try," Ethan replied, feeling something cold and determined settling in his chest. "They murdered a 7-year-old girl to protect their secrets. That's not something I can walk away from." For the first time since Sarah's death, Ethan Cole had found something worth fighting for that was bigger than his own grief. Anna Hoffman's journal had been protected by a waterproof case inside. Her purse, its leather cover worn soft by years of daily use. The pages revealed a woman's private thoughts during the most terrifying weeks of her life, written in careful German script that spoke of education and refinement. Ethan sat in his rented room as Marcus worked on additional security measures for their investigation, translating Anna's entries with the help of an online dictionary and the rusty German he'd picked up during his military service. Each page brought Anna's voice to life with heartbreaking clarity. March 3rd, Klaus came home late again, pale and shaking. "He says everything is fine, but I can see the fear in his eyes. He's been having nightmares about Robert's death, calling out his brother's name in his sleep. I found him in Lisa's room at 2 a.m., just watching her sleep, tears running down his face. Something is very wrong." The early entries chronicled a wife's growing concern as her husband became increasingly paranoid. and secretive. Klaus had tried to shield his family from the truth, but Anna's sharp intelligence had detected the changes in his behavior. His sudden interest in home security systems, his insistence that Lisa never walked to school alone. March 15th. Klaus bought new phones for all of us today. He said our old ones were compromised, but wouldn't explain what that means. He's teaching Lisa never to answer calls from numbers she doesn't recognize. She thinks it's a game, but I can see the terror underneath Klaus's playful tone. As Ethan read deeper into the journal, Anna's entries became more desperate. She'd begun to understand that her family was in danger, even if Klaus wouldn't explain the full scope of the threat they faced. March 22nd, I found Klaus burning papers in the fireplace at midnight. When I asked what they were, he just held me and said he was sorry for everything he was putting us through. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would take Lisa and run. He gave me a list of people to contact, safe places to go. I'm scared, but I trust him. The parallels to Ethan's own experience were devastating. Like Sarah, Anna had been a devoted wife, trying to support her husband through a crisis she didn't fully understand. Like Sarah, she'd been an innocent victim of circumstances beyond her control. But unlike Sarah, Anna had known danger was coming. April 1st. Klaus says we have to leave Munich immediately. He won't tell me why, only that people are coming for him and we're not safe here anymore. Lisa is confused and frightened by the sudden change in our lives. She keeps asking when we can go home, and I don't know what to tell her because Klaus says we might never be able to go back. The final entries, written during their flight to Salzburg, revealed a mother's desperate attempt to maintain normalcy for her daughter, while knowing their world was collapsing around them. April 3rd. On the plane to Salzburg, Klaus is trying to act normal for Lisa's sake, but his hands shake when he thinks we're not looking. The pilot seems nervous too, checking his instruments constantly. Lisa is drawing pictures to calm herself. The same family portraits she always makes when she's anxious. She's so young, so innocent. She doesn't understand why Mama and Papa are scared. The last entry was written in a shaking hand, probably during the flight's final moments. Something is wrong with the plane. Klaus is holding Lisa while she cries. He's whispering that everything will be okay, but I can see in his eyes that he knows it won't be. If we don't survive this, I want whoever finds this journal to know that Klaus is a good man who tried to do the right thing. Tell his story. Make sure the world knows what they did to us. Ethan closed the journal, his vision blurred by tears he didn't bother to hide. Anna's final words were a commission, a dying mother's plea for justice that transcended death itself. She'd known they were going to die, known her 7-year-old daughter would never grow up, known her husband's courage in fighting corruption had doomed them all. But she'd still found the strength to think about truth and justice in her final moments. The emotional weight of Anna's words was overwhelming, but they also provided crucial intelligence. The journal confirmed that Klaus's murder had been carefully planned and that their killers had infiltrated the aviation system. More importantly, Anna had documented names and details that Klaus might have kept to himself to protect his family. Friedrich Brenner wasn't just Klaus's business partner. He was Anna's cousin, a family member who'd betrayed them for money. The journal revealed that Brenner had been feeding information about Klaus's investigation to the criminal organization, tracking his every move and reporting his contacts to their would-be killers. Anna had discovered Brenner's betrayal during the family's final days in Munich, finding text messages on his phone when he'd visited their house under the pretense of offering help. The messages detailed Klaus's movements, his meetings with law enforcement contacts, even Lisa's school schedule. Brenner had been planning to use Lisa as leverage against Klaus, threatening the child's safety to force her father's silence. Only Klaus's decision to flee immediately had prevented his daughter from being kidnapped and used as a weapon against him. The journal also revealed the existence of a safe deposit box in Salzburg, where Klaus had hidden additional evidence. Anna had been carrying the key when they died, and according to her final entries, the box contained evidence that could implicate government officials and law enforcement officers who'd been bought by the criminal organization. But it was Anna's description of their last phone call with Father Brennan that sent chills down Ethan's spine. The priest hadn't just been a contact for Klaus's evidence. He'd been a longtime family friend who'd officiated at Klaus and Anna's wedding. When Klaus had called to arrange their meeting in Salzburg, Father Brennan had been terrified, warning them that dangerous people had been asking questions about Klaus and suggesting the family flee the country immediately. Father Brennan's subsequent disappearance suggested he'd either been killed for his connection to Klaus or had gone into hiding to protect himself. Either way, the evidence Klaus had planned to deliver to him was now locked in a Salzburg bank vault, protected by security measures that would require either legal authorization or considerable criminal skill to bypass. Marcus looked up from his laptop as Ethan finished reading. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Several of them," Ethan replied, setting the journal aside carefully. Anna Hoffman was an extraordinary woman. She documented everything, even knowing she was going to die. What did she write about? Ethan summarized the journal's contents, watching Marcus's expression grow increasingly grim as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. When he finished, Marcus sat back in his chair and whistled softly. "So we're not just dealing with corporate criminals," Marcus said. "We're dealing with people who have contacts inside the government, law enforcement, and aviation authorities. People who can make entire families disappear without any official investigation. That's about the size of it. And now they know someone has been asking questions about the Hoffmans because you've been making inquiries online." Ethan had been trying not to think about that particular problem, but Marcus was right. His research into Klaus, Anna, and Lisa had left digital footprints that sophisticated surveillance could easily detect. If the organization responsible for the Hoffmans' deaths was monitoring internet searches related to their victims, they would know someone was investigating. "How long do you think we have before they track us down?" Ethan asked. Marcus was already packing his equipment. "If they're as good as Klaus's evidence suggests, they probably already know you're in Grindelwald. We need to move, and we need to assume they're coming for us tonight. Where can we go?" "Salzburg," Marcus replied without hesitation. "If there's evidence in that safe deposit box that can bring these people down, we need to get it before they figure out where Klaus hid it." "How do we access a safe deposit box without legal authorization?" Marcus grinned, the expression both reassuring and slightly terrifying. "Remember that cybersecurity consulting I mentioned? Sometimes my clients need help recovering data from systems they've been locked out of. Bank security systems are just another type of computer network." As they prepared to leave Grindelwald, Ethan made one final phone call to Emma's grandparents. Helen Weber answered, her voice warm with the kind of grandmotherly concern that made Ethan's chest ache. "Ethan, dear, how are you? Emma's been asking when you're coming home." "Tell her I miss her," Ethan said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Tell her Daddy's working on something important, but he'll be home soon. Are you all right? You sound strange." "I'm fine. Just take care of her, Helen. Make sure she's safe." There was a pause before Helen responded, her voice reflecting the concern of a woman who'd raised children and recognized trouble when she heard it. "Ethan, what's wrong? What kind of work are you doing up there?" "The kind that matters," he replied. "I love you both. Give Emma my love." He ended the call before Helen could ask more questions, knowing that the less she knew about his current situation, the safer she and Emma would be. As they drove toward Salzburg in Marcus's rented car, Ethan thought about Anna's final words in her journal. She'd asked whoever found her story to make sure the world knew what had been done to her family. That was exactly what he intended to do, even if it cost him everything he had left to lose. The Hoffman family deserved justice, and Ethan Cole was going to make sure they got it. The hospital bracelet was hidden in a crevice of the aircraft's interior wall, small enough that Ethan had missed it during his initial searches, but significant enough to change everything he thought he knew about the Hoffman family's final moments. The plastic band was child-sized, marked with St. Antonius Hospital, Innsbruck, and a patient number, but it was the name that made Ethan's world tilt on its axis. Lisa Hoffman, age 7. The bracelet was dated 3 days after the crash. Ethan stared at the small piece of plastic with growing horror, his mind struggling to process the implications. Lisa hadn't died in the crash. She'd survived the initial impact, somehow made it to a hospital in Innsbruck, and lived for 3 more. Days before what? Marcus pulled the car over when he saw Ethan's face. "What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Lisa survived," Ethan said, his voice hollow. "The 7-year-old girl survived the crash." He showed Marcus the bracelet, watching his friend's expression mirror his own shock and revulsion. If Lisa had made it to a hospital, there would be records, witnesses, medical staff who'd treated her. There would be evidence of what had happened during those 3 final days of her life. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered. "Those bastards didn't just murder her parents. They hunted down an injured child and finished the job." The drive to Innsbruck took 2 hours, time Ethan spent in a cold rage that felt different from any emotion he'd experienced since Sarah's death. This wasn't the helpless grief of a man who'd lost his wife to random chance. This was the focused fury of a father contemplating the deliberate murder of someone else's child. St. Antonius Hospital was a modern facility on the outskirts of Innsbruck, its emergency entrance bustling with the controlled chaos typical of trauma centers. Ethan approached the information desk with the hospital bracelet and a carefully crafted story about being a relative trying to trace his missing niece. The clerk was sympathetic but firm about privacy regulations until Ethan produced Klaus's identification documents and Lisa's birth certificate, both recovered from the crash site. The family resemblance between Klaus and Ethan was close enough to be convincing, especially when supported by official documentation. "I'm sorry for your loss," the clerk said, consulting her computer records. Lisa was brought in 3 years ago after being found injured in a remote area. She was in critical condition, multiple fractures, internal bleeding, severe head trauma. "Who found her?" Ethan asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Mountain rescue, according to the records. A hiking party reported seeing an injured child near a camping area. She was unconscious when they brought her in, and she never regained consciousness." That was a lie. Lisa had been conscious enough to be terrified, conscious enough to call for parents who were already dead. The official story was sanitized fiction, designed to cover up the truth about what had really happened to her. "Can I see her medical records?" The clerk hesitated. "I'm not supposed to—" "Please," Ethan said, letting real pain show in his voice. "She was my brother's only child. I just need to understand what happened to her." 20 minutes later, Ethan was reading through Lisa Hoffman's medical file in a small conference room, each page revealing new horrors. The child had indeed been found by mountain rescue, but not in a camping area. She'd been discovered in a cave system 15 kilometers from the crash site, suggesting she'd either walked that distance while severely injured or had been moved there by someone else. The medical notes told a story of remarkable survival, followed by inexplicable death. Lisa had arrived at the hospital with injuries consistent with an aircraft crash, broken ribs, a fractured skull, internal bleeding. But her condition had been stabilizing under treatment. The trauma surgeon's notes indicated cautious optimism about her recovery. Then, on her 3rd day in the hospital, Lisa had suffered what the records described as sudden cardiac arrest of unknown origin. Despite aggressive intervention, she'd been declared dead at 3:47 a.m., but it was the notation in her toxicology report that made Ethan's blood run cold. Lisa had tested positive for succinylcholine, a paralytic drug used in surgical procedures, that when administered improperly could cause respiratory failure and cardiac arrest. The levels in her blood were far higher than any legitimate medical use would require. Someone had murdered Lisa Hoffman in her hospital bed, using a drug that would mimic natural complications from her injuries. The medical examiner's report was even more damning once Ethan knew what to look for. The official cause of death was listed as complications from traumatic injuries, but the detailed findings described symptoms consistent with paralytic poisoning. Lisa had been awake and aware as the drug stopped her breathing, unable to move or call for help as she died. A 7-year-old girl had spent her final moments paralyzed and terrified, murdered by people who couldn't afford to let her live to testify about what she'd seen. Marcus found Ethan in the hospital parking lot an hour later, sitting in the car and staring at nothing with a 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much human evil to process. "That bad?" Marcus asked quietly. "They tortured a child," Ethan said, his voice flat and emotionless. "They let her live for 3 days, probably questioning her about what her father had told her, what evidence he might have hidden. Then they killed her with drugs that made sure she suffered." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want to do?" "I want to find the people responsible and make them pay for what they did." And then Ethan thought about Emma, safe with her grandparents and unaware of the darkness that existed in the world. He thought about the promise he'd made to always come home to his family, a promise that circumstances had made impossible to keep. "Then I want to go home to my daughter and try to be the father she deserves." The safe deposit box in Salzburg contained everything Klaus had promised and more. Marcus's skills with electronic security systems proved unnecessary. The key from Anna's purse opened the box without difficulty, revealing a cache of evidence that could topple governments and destroy criminal organizations across 3 continents. Klaus had been more than just a businessman gathering evidence against his company's criminal activities. He'd been a deep-cover intelligence asset, working for a joint task force involving German BKA, Interpol, and the FBI. His 3 years of evidence gathering had been part of an international operation aimed at dismantling one of the world's largest money laundering networks. The evidence in the box included recordings of government officials accepting bribes, photographs of weapons shipments bound for terrorist organizations, and financial records documenting the flow of drug money through European banks. But most importantly, it contained a complete organizational chart of the criminal network, with names, photographs, and detailed information about every major player. Friedrich Brenner was just a middle manager in an organization that reached into the highest levels of European business and government. The real power belonged to a consortium of crime bosses, corrupt politicians, and multinational corporations that had been operating with impunity for decades. At the center of the conspiracy was a man Ethan recognized from international news coverage, a respected businessman and philanthropist whose charitable foundation was actually a front for human trafficking and arms dealing. Viktor Kozlov was just one tentacle of an octopus whose reach extended into every major criminal enterprise in Europe. But Klaus had done more than just gather evidence. He'd developed a plan to bring down the entire organization, using his position within Hoffman Industries to feed false information to the conspiracy while secretly coordinating with law enforcement agencies across multiple countries. The plan had been scheduled to culminate in coordinated raids that would have arrested over 200 suspects simultaneously, seizing assets worth billions of dollars and dismantling criminal networks that had operated for generations. Klaus's murder had prevented those raids from happening. Without his inside intelligence, the law enforcement operation had collapsed, leaving the criminals free to continue their activities while believing their security had been compromised only by Klaus himself. They had no idea that Klaus's evidence had survived, or that their complete organizational structure was documented in meticulous detail in a safe deposit box in Austria. "We can finish this," Marcus said, studying the operational plans Klaus had developed with his law enforcement contacts. All the groundwork is done. We just need to get this evidence to the right people and hope they don't kill us before we can do it, Ethan replied. As if summoned by his words, Ethan's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. We know what you found. Return what belongs to us, and your daughter will remain safe. Attached to the message was a photograph of Emma leaving her school in Zurich, taken from a distance but clear enough to show her face and the distinctive backpack Sarah had bought. The previous Christmas, the war had just become personal. Ethan's military dog tags felt cold against his chest as he slipped them over his head for the first time in 3 years. The metal rectangles bore his name, rank, and blood type, simple facts that had once defined his identity as a soldier. Now they represented something different, a reminder of who he'd been before grief had broken him and who he needed to become. Again, to protect his daughter, the photograph of Emma had changed everything. This was no longer about justice for the Hoffman family, though that remained important. This was about ensuring that Emma didn't become another victim of the same criminal organization that had murdered Lisa, Anna, and Klaus, the predators, who'd hunted down a 7-year-old survivor in a hospital bed, wouldn't hesitate to harm Emma if they thought it would serve their purposes. How do they even know about Emma? Marcus asked, studying the threatening message on Ethan's phone. You've been careful about operational security. Not careful enough, Ethan replied, his mind already shifting into the tactical thinking that had kept him alive during his military service. They must have been monitoring my communications, tracking my movements. They know I found the crash site. They know I have Klaus's evidence, and they've identified Emma as leverage. Marcus pulled up surveillance detection software on his laptop, scanning for digital traces of their activities over the past week. The results were sobering. Their internet searches, phone calls, and even GPS coordinates had been monitored by sophisticated tracking systems that suggested government-level surveillance capabilities. These people have access to intelligence resources, Marcus said grimly. They're not just criminals. They're criminals with state-level backing. That realization forced Ethan to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the conspiracy. This wasn't just a criminal organization that had corrupted some government officials. This was a criminal organization that had become so powerful it could operate with the tacit support of intelligence agencies and law enforcement institutions. Klaus Hoffman hadn't just been murdered to protect criminal secrets, he'd been eliminated, because his evidence threatened to expose the complicity of legitimate institutions in illegal activities. The conspiracy reached into agencies that were supposed to protect citizens from exactly this kind of criminal enterprise. We can't trust law enforcement, Ethan said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. After years of working with police and intelligence agencies during his military service, the idea of viewing them as potential enemies was deeply unsettling. So what do we do? Marcus asked. We handle this ourselves. Ethan's first priority was ensuring Emma's immediate safety. He called Helen Weber, forcing his voice to remain calm and casual despite the panic clawing at his chest. Helen, I need you to do something for me without asking questions. Ethan, what's wrong? You sound... Please, just listen. I need you to take Emma out of school early today and drive to your sister's house in Bern. Stay there until I call you. Don't tell anyone where you're going, don't use your credit cards, and don't answer calls from numbers you don't recognize. There was a long pause before Helen responded, her voice reflecting the concern of a grandmother who'd already lost one family member to violence. Ethan, you're scaring me. What kind of trouble are you in? The kind that requires me to make sure my daughter is safe. Please, Helen, trust me on this. What about Emma's school? What do I tell them? Family emergency, medical appointment, whatever you need to say. Just get her away from her normal routine and somewhere these people can't find her. Another pause. These people. Ethan, what have you gotten yourself into? "I'm trying to do the right thing," he said, thinking of Lisa's drawings and Anna's final journal entries. "But I need to know Emma is safe while I finish it." Helen's voice softened with understanding. "We'll leave within the hour. But Ethan, whatever you're doing, please be careful. Emma has already lost her mother. She can't lose her father, too." The call ended with promises Ethan wasn't sure he could keep. He wanted to tell Emma he loved her, wanted to hear her voice one more time before entering a situation that might not allow for second chances. But calling her directly would only frighten her and potentially give their enemies another opportunity to track his family. Instead, he composed a letter on his laptop, pouring 3 years of grief and love and regret into words he hoped he'd live to deliver in person. The letter explained everything: why he'd been distant since Sarah's death, why he'd failed to be the father Emma deserved, and why he was now risking everything to protect her. "Give this to Emma if something happens to me," he told Marcus, sealing the letter in an envelope. "Make sure she knows that everything I'm doing now is because I love her." Marcus took the letter without comment, understanding the weight of what Ethan was asking him to carry. With Emma's safety ensured, Ethan turned his attention to the tactical situation. The criminal organization knew he had Klaus's evidence, but they didn't know the full scope of what he'd discovered. They certainly didn't know about the safe deposit box in Salzburg or the complete operational plans Klaus had developed with international law enforcement. That gave him advantages he could exploit. The encrypted files on Klaus's USB drive included detailed intelligence on the organization's operational structure, security protocols, and personnel. Friedrich Brenner was scheduled to attend a board meeting at Hoffmann Industries headquarters in Munich the following day, a meeting where he would undoubtedly report on the security breach represented by Ethan's investigation. More importantly, the meeting would include other key figures in the conspiracy, including government officials and criminal leaders who rarely appeared in the same location simultaneously. Klaus's original plan had called for law enforcement raids during exactly this type of gathering, when maximum damage could be inflicted on the organization's leadership structure. Ethan could accomplish the same objective, but he'd have to do it alone. The plan he developed was dangerous and relied heavily on skills he hadn't used since his military service. But it had the advantage of being something his enemies wouldn't expect: a direct assault on their leadership by a single operative. With nothing left to lose, Marcus listened to the plan with growing alarm. "That's not a rescue mission, Ethan, that's a suicide mission." "Maybe," Ethan acknowledged, "but it's also the only way to ensure Emma stays safe. These people won't stop hunting us as long as they think we're a threat. I need to make them understand that threatening my daughter was the worst mistake they could have made. There has to be another way." "Like what? Go into hiding and hope they never find us? Live the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders? That's not living. That's just a different kind of dying." Ethan thought of the promise he'd made to Sarah the night before she died, the promise to always come home to his family. He'd broken that promise once through circumstances beyond his control. He wouldn't break it again, through cowardice or inaction. "Besides," he added, pulling on the tactical vest he'd borrowed from Marcus's equipment cache, "someone needs to finish what Klaus started. Those people murdered an entire family, including a 7-year-old girl. That's not something you walk away from." The final preparations took most of the night. Ethan studied building schematics for Hoffmann Industries headquarters, memorized personnel files for key targets, and planned insertion and extraction routes that would minimize collateral damage while maximizing the tactical impact of his mission. He also recorded video messages explaining everything he'd discovered about the Hoffmann family's murder and the criminal conspiracy responsible for their deaths. The recordings, along with complete copies of Klaus's evidence, were uploaded to secure servers with instructions for automatic release if Ethan didn't check in within 24 hours. If the mission failed and he didn't survive, at least the truth would emerge. Lisa, Anna, and Klaus would have their justice, even if it came at the cost of Ethan's life. As dawn broke over the Austrian countryside, Ethan made his final preparations. He checked his weapons, reviewed his tactical plan one last time, and he called Emma's grandparents to confirm they'd reached safety in Bern. "Tell Emma that Daddy loves her," he said to Helen. "Tell her that everything I'm doing is to make sure she can grow up in a world where bad people can't hurt innocent families." "You're going to tell her yourself when you come home," Helen replied firmly. "Don't you dare say goodbye to that little girl through her grandmother." "I'll do my best," Ethan promised. Before leaving for Munich, Ethan visited the small chapel in Salzburg, where Klaus had planned to meet Father Brennan. The priest's disappearance remained a mystery, but the chapel itself offered something Ethan needed: a quiet place to make peace with the possibility that this mission might be his last. He knelt in the empty sanctuary, thinking of Sarah and the life they'd built together, of Emma and the future she deserved, of Lisa Hoffman and the childhood that had been stolen from her. The anger that had sustained him through the investigation was still there, but it was tempered now by something deeper, a sense of purpose that transcended personal grief. For the first time since Sarah's death, Ethan felt like the man she'd fallen in love with. The soldier who fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The medic who ran toward danger to save lives. The father who would sacrifice everything to protect his child. He was ready to face whatever waited for him in Munich. The corporate conspiracy files represented 3 years of Klaus Hoffmann's life work. Every meeting recorded, every transaction documented, every connection mapped with the precision of a man who knew his evidence would need to survive his death. As Ethan sat in the rented BMW outside Hoffman Industries headquarters, these files weren't just intelligence, they were Klaus's final testament, his gift to anyone brave enough to finish what he'd started. The building rose 23 stories above Munich's business district, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun like a monument to legitimate enterprise. But Ethan knew what Klaus's files had revealed. This wasn't a manufacturing headquarters. It was the operational center of a criminal empire that had tentacles reaching across 3 continents. Friedrich Brenner's Mercedes arrived at exactly 9:15 a.m., just as Klaus's surveillance notes had predicted. The man who'd betrayed his own cousin's family stepped out of his luxury vehicle with the confidence of someone who believed his crimes were untouchable. He had no idea that Anna's journal contained detailed accounts of his treachery, or that Klaus had recorded their final confrontation when Brenner had threatened Lisa's safety. Ethan watched through binoculars as other figures from Klaus's files arrived for the board meeting. Viktor Kozlov, the Russian crime boss whose organization specialized in human trafficking. Dr. Elizabeth Meyer, the government official who'd ensured the Hoffman family's deaths were never investigated. Marcus Stellman, the aviation authority, director who'd covered up the crash. Each arrival represented another piece of the conspiracy that had murdered the Hoffmans. By the time the meeting began, Klaus's files indicated 7 of the organization's most powerful leaders would be gathered in the same conference room, an opportunity that would never come again. Ethan's phone buzzed with a text message. "Building. Secure. They're all inside. Are you sure about this?" Marcus was positioned in a surveillance van 6 blocks away, monitoring police communications and providing technical support for the mission. His role was to ensure Ethan had early warning of any law enforcement response, while documenting everything that happened for the evidence files. "I'm sure," Ethan typed back, checking his equipment one final time. The tactical vest concealed recording devices that would capture every word spoken during the confrontation. The weapons he carried were loaded with non-lethal ammunition designed to incapacitate rather than kill. This was about justice, not revenge. The security checkpoint in the lobby was staffed by guards who clearly took their jobs seriously. But Ethan's false credentials identified him as a building inspector conducting a routine safety audit. Klaus's files had included the inspection schedule and the proper authorization codes, making Ethan's entry appear completely legitimate. The elevator ride to the 20th floor gave him time to review the building layout one final time. Klaus had been thorough in his surveillance, documenting everything from emergency exits to security camera blind spots. The conference room, where the meeting was taking place, had only one entrance, making it a perfect trap for anyone inside when the truth finally emerged. Ethan's military training took over as he moved through the executive offices, his footsteps silent on the expensive carpeting. The secretaries and junior staff paid no attention to a man in a building inspector's uniform carrying official-looking equipment, their focus on their daily routines rather than the danger walking among them. The conference room door was closed, but Ethan could hear voices through the soundproofing, multiple speakers discussing what Klaus's files had taught him to recognize as criminal activities conducted in corporate euphemisms. Restructuring operations in the eastern markets meant expanding human trafficking routes. Liquidating underperforming assets meant murdering potential witnesses. Ethan positioned his recording equipment, activated the video cameras concealed in his vest, and took a deep breath. Everything that happened next would determine whether Emma grew up in a world where justice was possible, or whether she'd spend her life looking over her shoulder at enemies who considered her family expendable. He opened the conference room door and stepped inside. The conversation stopped instantly as 7 of Europe's most dangerous criminals found themselves face to face with a man they'd assumed was dead. Friedrich Brenner's face went white as he recognized Ethan from surveillance photos. Viktor Kozlov's hand moved instinctively toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. "Gentlemen, Dr. Meyer," Ethan said calmly, closing the door behind him and activating the electronic lock that would prevent anyone from leaving. "I think it's time we had a conversation about the Hoffman family." Brenner was the first to recover his composure. "You're making a serious mistake. This is a private business meeting. You have no authority." "I have Klaus Hoffman's authority," Ethan interrupted, placing the conspiracy files on the conference table. 3 years of evidence documenting your criminal activities. Financial records, photographs, audio recordings, everything. Needed to put all of you in prison for the rest of your lives. Dr. Meyer leaned forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling dangerous situations. "Mr. Cole, isn't it? We know who you are. We know where your daughter goes to school, and we know how much you have to lose. Why don't you sit down and we can discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement? Like the arrangement you made with Klaus Hoffman," Ethan asked. "The one where you murdered his 7-year-old daughter in a hospital bed?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Viktor Kozlov spoke for the first time, his accent thick with menace. "You have evidence, we have your child. Simple trade. You walk away rich and your daughter stays safe." "That might have worked," Ethan replied, "if you hadn't made one crucial mistake." "What mistake?" Brenner demanded, his confidence beginning to crack. "You threatened my daughter." Ethan's voice carried the cold certainty of a man who'd made peace with the consequences of his actions. "That changed this from an investigation into a war." The room erupted into motion as Kozlov drew his weapon, but Ethan was already moving with the fluid precision of his military training. The first shot from his non-lethal ammunition struck Kozlov in the chest, the impact sending him sprawling across the conference table as electrical current from the taser round incapacitated him. Dr. Meyer lunged for the emergency alarm, but Ethan's second shot caught her before she could reach the button. She collapsed to the floor, conscious but unable to move as the neuromuscular disruption device did its work. "Security will be here in minutes," Brenner shouted, backing toward the windows. "You can't escape." "I'm not trying to escape," Ethan replied, methodically securing the remaining conspirators with zip-tie restraints he'd brought for this purpose. "I'm trying to make sure you face justice for what you did to the Hoffman family." Marcus Stellman, the aviation official who'd covered up the crash, was babbling incoherently about immunity deals and government protection. The other conspirators maintained sullen silence, their eyes calculating the odds of survival versus the certainty of life imprisonment. Ethan pulled out a tablet computer and began playing video files from Klaus's evidence collection. The conference room's large display screen filled with images of the conspirators discussing murder with casual indifference, authorizing the elimination of witnesses, planning the assassination of an entire family. "This is what Klaus Hoffmann died trying to expose," Ethan said, his voice cutting through their protests and threats. "This is what Anna Hoffmann wrote about in her final journal entry. This is what 7-year-old Lisa Hoffmann was murdered. To keep secret, the door's electronic lock disengaged as building security overrode the system, but instead of guards, Marcus Webb entered the conference room with a team of armed federal agents. The real building security had been quietly neutralized and replaced 20 minutes earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, displaying official credentials, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, money laundering, and about 40 other charges that will be detailed in your indictments." The arrests were swift and professional. Each conspirator secured and read their rights, while Ethan's recording equipment documented every word. But it was Friedrich Brenner who provided the final damning admission as he was led away in handcuffs. "You have no idea what you've destroyed." He snarled at Ethan. "This organization reaches into every government, every agency. We'll be back on the streets in 6 months while you and your daughter spend the rest of your lives running." "Actually," Marcus said, smiling with satisfaction, "that's where you're wrong. This operation was coordinated with law enforcement agencies in 17 countries. While we were arresting you, simultaneous raids were taking place across 3 continents. Your entire network is being dismantled as we speak." The Klaus Hoffmann files hadn't just documented the conspiracy, they'd provided the roadmap for destroying it completely. Sarah's photograph had been in Ethan's wallet since their wedding day, a candid shot of her laughing at something ridiculous he'd said during their honeymoon in Italy. He pulled it out now as the federal agents finished processing the crime scene, needing to see her face as the weight of what they'd accomplished settled over him. The confrontation with the criminal organization was over, but the final battle was taking place in Ethan's heart. For 3 years, he'd carried the crushing guilt of failing to protect Sarah, of being absent when she needed him most. That guilt had poisoned his relationship with Emma and nearly destroyed his will to live. But looking at Sarah's photograph, now, surrounded by the evidence of Klaus Hoffmann's courage and sacrifice, Ethan finally understood what Sarah would have wanted from him. Not self-destruction and endless guilt, but the strength to honor her memory by protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. Friedrich Brenner made one last attempt at intimidation as the agents prepared to transport him to federal detention. "This isn't over, Cole. We have resources you can't imagine, connections that reach—" "It's over," Ethan interrupted, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Klaus Hoffmann spent 3 years building an airtight case against your organization. Every financial transaction, every criminal contact, every government official you've corrupted, it's all documented. Your network is finished." Dr. Elizabeth Meyer, still groggy from the taser's effects, tried a different approach. "You have a daughter to think about, Mr. Cole. Even with us in custody, there are others who might seek revenge. Surely we can reach some accommodation." "The only accommodation you're going to reach is with a federal judge," Marcus Webb said firmly. "And just so we're clear, Mr. Cole's daughter is under federal protection. Anyone who even thinks about threatening her will find themselves facing the full resources of 3 governments. Viktor Kozlov, the Russian crime boss who'd built his empire on human trafficking and murder, maintained his sullen silence until the agents were leading him away. Then he looked directly at Ethan and spoke with the cold certainty of a man who'd spent his life dealing in violence. "You think this ends it? You think Klaus Hoffmann was the only one with evidence? There are others, Cole. Others who know what happened here today, who know you're responsible for our arrests. They'll come for you. They'll come for your daughter. And when they do, Ethan stepped closer to Kozlov, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. Let them come. I'm not the broken man I was when this started. I'm the soldier who learned to fight for people who can't fight for themselves. I'm the father who'll do anything to protect his child. And I'm the man who just proved that criminals like you aren't untouchable. He held up Sarah's photograph so Kozlov could see it. My wife believed that good people could make a difference in the world, even when that difference comes at a cost. She was right. Klaus and Anna Hoffman were right. And 7-year-old Lisa Hoffman's death won't be meaningless, as long as men like you face justice for your crimes. The agents led Kozlov away, but his threats echoed in the conference room like a promise of future violence. Ethan understood that dismantling this criminal organization wouldn't eliminate all the dangers in the world, but it would ensure that the Hoffman family's sacrifice had served a purpose larger than their killer's greed. Marcus approached as the last of the conspirators was taken into custody. It's done, brother. Klaus's operation is complete. What about the others Kozlov mentioned? The people who might want revenge. Interpol has been tracking this organization for years. Between Klaus's evidence and the arrests we made today, we've identified and neutralized most of their operational capacity. There might be some low-level criminals who slip through the cracks, but the leadership structure is destroyed. Ethan nodded, but his mind was already shifting from tactical concerns to personal ones. The mission was complete, but the real challenge was just beginning. Rebuilding his relationship with Emma and learning to be the father she deserved. I need to call Helen, he said, pulling out his phone. I need to tell Emma that Daddy's coming home. The call connected on the second ring, Helen's voice tight with anxiety. Ethan, thank God. Are you all right? Is it over? It's over, he said, feeling the truth of those words in his bones. The people who were threatening us are in custody. Emma is safe. We're all safe. There was a pause. Then Helen's voice, softer now. She's been asking about you constantly. She wants to know when you're coming home, when you can read bedtime. Stories again. Soon, Ethan promised. Very soon. Can I talk to her? Of course. Emma, come here, sweetheart. Daddy's on the phone. The sound of small feet running across a wooden floor, then Emma's voice, bright with excitement and relief. Daddy, are you okay? Oma said you were working on something important. I'm fine, sweetheart. I was helping some people who needed help, but I'm all done now. I'm coming home. Really? You're really coming home? Ethan thought of the empty cottage in Grindelwald, of the toys and books waiting in Emma's bedroom, of all the bedtime stories he'd missed, and all the drawings he hadn't been there to admire. Really? And Emma, when I get home, I want to see all the pictures you've drawn while I was away. I want to hear about school and your friends and everything that's been happening in your life. I drew one of you and me and Mama, Emma said, her voice carrying the innocent hope of a child who still believed in happy endings. We're all holding hands like we used to. Ethan closed his eyes, seeing Sarah's smile in his memory and feeling something that had been broken inside him finally, beginning to heal. That sounds like a beautiful picture, sweetheart. I can't wait to see it. I love you, Daddy. I love you too, Emma, more than all the mountains in Switzerland. After ending the call, Ethan stood in the empty conference room where justice had finally been served for the Hoffman family. Klaus's evidence files were now in the hands of prosecutors who would ensure that Lisa, Anna, and Klaus received the justice they deserved. The criminal organization that had murdered them was destroyed, its leaders facing decades in prison. But more than that, Ethan had found his way back to being the man Sarah had fallen in love with, the protector, the fighter for justice, the father who would sacrifice everything for his child's safety. The photograph of Sarah seemed to smile at him from his wallet, and for the first time since her death, Ethan smiled back. She would have been proud of what he'd accomplished, proud that he'd found the strength to honor her memory by protecting others. Now it was time to go home to Emma and begin the long, healing work of rebuilding their family. 3 months after the arrests in Munich, Ethan stood before a gathering of law enforcement officials and victims' families in a federal courthouse in Berlin, holding a small stuffed teddy bear that had belonged to Lisa Hoffman. The bear had been found in the wreckage, somehow preserved despite 3 years of exposure to alpine weather, and now it served as a symbol of innocence lost and justice finally served. Lisa Hoffman was 7 years old when she died, Ethan said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. She loved drawing pictures of her family. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, and she believed that her father could protect her from anything. She was wrong about that last part, but not because Klaus Hoffmann didn't try. The sentencing hearing for Friedrich Brenner and his co-conspirators had drawn international attention, with prosecutors from 17 countries presenting evidence of crimes that spanned continents and cost hundreds of lives. But Ethan's testimony wasn't about the scope of the criminal organization. It was about remembering the victims as human beings rather than statistics. Klaus Hoffmann died trying to expose the truth about the people sitting in this courtroom. Today, Ethan continued, looking directly at Brenner, Anna Hoffman died because she loved her husband and trusted him to keep their family safe. Lisa Hoffman died because she was a witness to her parents' murder. A 7-year-old girl who threatened no one but couldn't be allowed to live. Emma sat in the gallery with her grandparents, too young to fully understand the proceedings, but old enough to sense their importance. She clutched a drawing she'd made for her father, a picture of the two of them hiking in the mountains, holding hands under a bright yellow sun that looked remarkably similar to the one Lisa had drawn in her final artwork. The parallel wasn't lost on Ethan. Both girls had possessed the same innocent faith that their fathers would always be there to protect them. The difference was that Emma's faith had been rewarded with a father who'd learned to fight for what mattered most. Judge Maria Antonelli read the sentences with the gravity appropriate to crimes of such magnitude. Life imprisonment for Friedrich Brenner, consecutive life sentences for Viktor Kozlov, decades in federal prison for the government officials who'd enabled the conspiracy through corruption and willful blindness. But it was her closing remarks that resonated most deeply with Ethan. The evidence in this case demonstrates that ordinary citizens can still hold the powerful accountable when they have the courage to pursue truth and justice. Klaus Hoffmann paid the ultimate price for that courage, but his sacrifice was not in vain. After the hearing, Ethan found himself in the courthouse lobby with relatives of other victims, people who'd spent years wondering what had happened to missing family members. The Hoffman case had broken open dozens of other investigations, leading to the recovery of bodies and the resolution of mysteries that had haunted families across Europe. "Thank you," said an elderly woman whose daughter had been murdered for investigating the organization's arms dealing. Maria had been missing for 4 years. At least now we know what happened to her, and we know the people responsible will pay. Similar conversations repeated throughout the afternoon as Ethan met family members who'd finally received answers about their lost loved ones. Klaus's evidence hadn't just solved one crime. It had provided closure for dozens of families who'd been denied justice for years. But the most important conversation was the one he had with Emma during the drive back to Grindelwald. She'd been unusually quiet since leaving Berlin, processing the adult world of crime and punishment that had intruded on her childhood. "Daddy," she said as they wound through the mountain roads toward home, "are the bad people really gone now? The ones who hurt the family I was trying to help are gone," Ethan replied carefully. "They're in prison where they can't hurt anyone else. But there might be other bad people." Ethan considered his answer carefully, balancing honesty with age-appropriate reassurance. "There are always people in the world who make bad choices, sweetheart, but there are also good people who work to stop them. Police officers, judges, and sometimes regular people like your daddy who decide to help when they see something wrong." Emma was quiet for a moment, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. "I made something for you," she said, unwrapping a clay figure of a man in hiking boots standing next to a small girl. "It's you and me," she explained, her voice carrying the pride of a child who'd created something special. "I made it in art class when I was worried about you. The teacher said it was okay to be scared when someone you love is doing something dangerous." Ethan pulled the car over to examine the clay figures more closely, fighting back tears at the love and skill his daughter had poured into her creation. The man figure was clearly recognizable as him, complete with his hiking gear and the determined expression Emma had learned to associate with her father's serious moods. "It's beautiful," he said, holding the sculpture carefully. "Just like all your artwork. I'm sorry I missed so many of your drawings while I was away." "That's okay," Emma replied with the easy forgiveness of childhood. "You were helping people who needed help. Mama always said that's what good people do." The mention of Sarah no longer brought the crushing pain it once had. Instead, Ethan felt a warm sadness mixed with gratitude for the time they'd had together and the daughter they'd created. "Your mama was right about that," he said. "She was right about a lot of things." That evening, Ethan tucked Emma into her bed in the cottage that had finally begun to feel like home again. The walls of her room were covered with new artwork, drawings she'd created during his absence that told the story of a little girl missing her father but keeping faith that he would return. "Will you read me a story?" Emma asked, settling under covers that still smelled like the lavender Sarah had loved. "Of course. What would you like to hear?" "The one about the mountain rescue," Emma said, referring to a story Ethan had told her years earlier about a lost hiker who'd been saved by the courage of ordinary people who refused to give up searching. As Ethan began the familiar tale, he realized that he was telling his own story as much as Emma's favorite fiction. Like the lost hiker in the story, he'd been rescued by the courage of others, Klaus and Anna Hoffman, who died protecting evidence that could save other families, Marcus Webb, who'd risked his own safety to help a friend pursue justice, even Emma herself, whose love had given him a reason to fight when everything else seemed lost. "And they all lived happily ever after?" Emma asked as the story concluded, her voice already heavy with approaching sleep. "They lived good lives," Ethan corrected gently, using the more honest ending he'd learned to prefer. "Not always easy lives, but good ones. Lives filled with love and purpose and the knowledge that they'd helped make the world a little bit better." After Emma fell asleep, Ethan sat in his study and opened the final item from Klaus Hoffman's effects, a letter addressed to whoever finds our story. Klaus had written it during their final flight to Salzburg, apparently sensing that their time was running out. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then Anna and Lisa and I are probably dead, and someone has found the evidence we tried so hard to preserve. Please don't let our deaths be meaningless. The people who killed us believe they are untouchable, that their wealth and power place them beyond the reach of justice. Prove them wrong." The letter continued with specific instructions for contacting Klaus's allies in law enforcement and intelligence agencies, along with detailed explanations of how to interpret the evidence they'd gathered. But it was the final paragraph that Ethan treasured most. "Anna and I brought Lisa into this world, believing it could be a place where good people triumph over evil, where children can grow up safe and loved, where truth and justice aren't just ideals, but realities worth fighting for. We still believe that, even knowing we may not live to see it proven. If you've found this letter, then you have the power to prove it. Don't let fear stop you from doing what's right." Ethan carefully folded the letter and placed it in the file cabinet where he kept Emma's artwork and Sarah's personal effects, documents that told the story of lives lived with love and purpose. Klaus, Anna, and Lisa Hoffman had earned their place among those treasured memories. 6 months later, Ethan received a call from Interpol informing him that the final members of the criminal organization had been arrested in a coordinated operation spanning 4 countries. The evidence Klaus had gathered continued to bear fruit, leading to convictions and asset seizures that dismantled an entire network of corruption and violence. But the call that mattered most came from Emma's school, informing him that she'd won first place in the regional art competition with a painting titled "My Hero." The artwork showed a man and a little girl standing on a mountain peak, looking out over a valley where families were safe and children could play without fear. When Ethan arrived at the school for the awards ceremony, he found Emma surrounded by classmates who were eager to hear about her father's adventures. She told them the story with 8-year-old enthusiasm, describing how her daddy had helped put bad people in jail and made the world safer for families like theirs. "Is it true your daddy found a crashed airplane in the mountains?" one of the children asked. "Yes," Emma replied proudly, "and he made sure the family got justice, even though they were already dead. Daddy says that's what good people do. They help others even when it's dangerous." Listening to his daughter explain his choices to her friends, Ethan realized that the greatest victory hadn't been the arrests or the convictions or the dismantling of the criminal network. The greatest victory was raising a daughter who understood that some things were worth fighting for even when the cost was high. That evening, as they hiked together on a trail near their cottage, Emma asked the question Ethan had been expecting. "Daddy, will you teach me to help people like you help that family?" "Someday," he promised, watching her scramble over rocks with the fearless confidence of childhood. "When you're older, if you still want to learn." "I do want to learn," Emma said firmly. "Mama always said we should help people who need help, and the Mountain family needed help even though they were dead." As they reached a viewpoint overlooking the valley where Ethan had first discovered Klaus Hoffmann's evidence, Emma pulled out her sketchbook and began drawing. The picture she created showed their cottage nestled among the peaks with stick figures of their family, including a new edition labeled "Mama Watching from Heaven." For the first time since Sarah's death, Ethan looked at his daughter's artwork and saw not painful reminders of loss, but hopeful promises of the future they were building together. Lisa Hoffmann's teddy bear sat on Emma's dresser now, a gift from a girl who'd never grow up to a girl, who would grow up understanding the difference between right and wrong. The mountains that had once been Ethan's refuge from grief had become something better, a place where he and Emma could build new memories while honoring the old ones. Where a broken father had learned to fight for justice, and a grieving daughter had learned that her daddy would always come home when she needed him. Sometimes losing everything really was the only way to find what truly mattered. And sometimes the greatest discoveries happened not when you had nothing left to lose, but when you finally understood what was worth protecting with your life.